Welcome. Today you're going to learn 9 tips to scale to $100 million in ARR and beyond without sacrificing your high bar for account executive and sales talent. Okay, so are you worried about hitting your account executive headcount targets without sacrificing your bar for AE talent? Right? It's pretty easy to maintain a high bar for talent if you're hiring slowly, if you're growing slowly, because you can overinvest in making the right hiring decisions. Now, as you start to rapidly scale your company, that becomes less of a thing. You're starting to hire fast. And so often companies start to see their AE talent bar decay as they skate toward $100 million in ARR and beyond. Now, sales hiring is already a terrifying crapshoot, right? 40% of SaaS account executives attrit or are managed out of the business within their first 12 months. And the average cost, opportunity cost of ARR is about $266,000. Now it depends on what your quota is and how much quota you issue onto the street and what your ramp time is, et cetera. But I think we can all agree that you miss out on a lot of ARR when you mishire account executives and when they attrit within their first year or so. Now, the pressure to grow creates a dilemma, right? When you have daunting headcount targets, you're often stuck with making a choice between one of these two choices. Number one is, do you make your headcount targets and you hire fast enough, but because you hired so fast, you tolerate a 40, maybe even 50% early tenure attrition and mishire rate? Or alternatively, on the right side of the slide here, do you miss your headcount targets? Okay, do you keep your high bar for talent, but because of the time it took, you miss your headcount targets? Both of these situations cost 7, sometimes 8 figures worth of ARR, depending on the scale of your company. Now, I was talking to a chief revenue officer the other day who's well on his way to growing his company toward $100 million in ARR, but certainly not without some growing pains. Okay, he was telling me about a single hiring class, a 1-month hiring class where he had 10 account executives starting. I think this was back in April or May. And in his model, he forecasted that he would attrit 30% of the account executives by month 12. Okay, that's a standard forecast. That's a very standard model in most ARR plans. Now, what ended up happening is those numbers were backward. Okay, he ended up attritting 70% of that 10-person class. In other words, 7 people were managed out of the business or left instead of the 3 that he had forecasted. And so he had 4 account executives more that attritted than what he had modeled. And him and I did some back of the napkin math together. And it turns out by month 4, the average account executive was producing about $60,000 in ARR. And it takes them about 4 months to backfill a replacement and get those new people up to speed. So if you take 4 account executives times $60,000 in ARR times 4 months to backfill and ramp new reps, we were looking at about $960,000 in missed ARR from one bad hiring class. Okay, almost $1 million in lost ARR from one bad class. Now you can imagine if you get a few of those throughout the year, or if you're consistently mishiring at a higher rate, even by a little bit, or if you start to make these mistakes at a bigger scale, right? Imagine if it was a 20-person hiring class. Now these ARR numbers start to look a lot bigger. So it can be very painful. And today we're going to talk about 9 ways to scale fast, but keep a high bar for account executive talent to not have a 40 to 50% early tenure attrition rate. Now, just so you know who I am and where I'm coming from, I'm best known for being the second United States-based employee at a company called Gong. I started when we were just under $200,000 in ARR. and I left the company at around $225 million in ARR. So I saw a lot when it came to scaling. I personally hired and scaled the most successful segment of our sales organization from 0 to 35 reps and a few managers. And I was involved in many more hires across the rest of the business, over 100 account executive hires during the 5.5-year tenure that I was there. So a quick warning before we get started, these 9 tips are not foundational hiring tips. We're not going to talk about behavioral interviewing or chronological interviewing. I'm assuming you have that stuff in place. Those are foundations needed for what you're about to learn in this video to work. Okay, if you feel like you need more of the basics before you dig into this advanced stuff we're going to talk about, go over to quotasignal.com. There's a ton of free resources. And we also have a paid online course called SaaS Hiring Masterclass. So number one of 9, get life-threatening clear about your ideal hiring profile. Okay, get life-threateningly clear about it. Now, lack of clarity on your ideal rep profile is the most deadly mistake when scaling sales headcount. Okay, it can turn your sales organization into a bit of a clusterfuck, right? If you don't know exactly who you're hiring for or what you're hiring for, the composition of your AE talent starts to get very messy. You get some superstars, you get some people who are totally out of place, and it turns into kind of this Wild West talent composition that gets really hard to scale and turns into very high attrition and mishire and lack of performance rates. Now, one thing I want to say about this is you don't have to be perfect when it comes to your ideal rep profile. You just have to be clear about it, okay? Because if you're clear about it, you can test it, you can iterate against it, and you can fix it. If you're not clear about it, you're not going to know what's wrong with it. It's that simple. It's almost like A/B testing a website. Now, there are 3 elements of an ideal rep profile that you need to define. And some of these will be more important depending on the tenure of rep you're hiring for. So number 1 is traits and characteristics, like a person's grit, competitiveness, coachability. Their execution experience, right? What have they done in their sales career and what's their track record of success? And then 3, their skills and knowledge, right? Do they know MEDDIC? Do they know how to run proof of concepts? Do they know SaaS sales methodologies? So the question is, what traits, skills, and experiences do reps need to accomplish your outcomes for that role and to execute your hiring process? And one of the best ways to answer this question is to attempt to deconstruct your current top producers, your existing top producers. What attributes are driving their overperformance? And how can you turn that into competencies that you vet for and screen for within your hiring process? So get clear on these attributes. The goal is to try to winnow it down to around 6 to 8 ideal attributes. And if you go beyond that, which I would encourage you to try to keep it to 6 to 8 things that are must-have for being successful, if you feel like you need more, then just make sure you and your team are aligned on which of these are must-have and which of these are nice to have. Okay, get life-threateningly clear on all of those things. And once you do that, organize it into an ideal rep profile that you and your sales leadership team or anybody else on the hiring panel uses to peg candidates against through your hiring process. Hey, number 2, design and execute a consistent hiring process. The enemy of scaling with a high talent bar is 2 words: ad hoc and inconsistency. Okay, those are your 2 worst enemies when it comes to scaling, especially when it comes to hiring. So on the other side of that coin, there are 3 elements of a consistent hiring process. It's important to get these right. Number 1, you define consistent stages and steps of the hiring process, much like a sales process, and every candidate should go through the same stages. Number 2, you're asking each question or each candidate the same questions throughout the hiring process. And then number 3, you're asking the same questions in the same order throughout the hiring process. When you do that well, you start to be able to see signal rather than noise very quickly. You start to be able to compare candidates. When you mix things up, when you don't have consistent stages, you're asking different questions, you're asking questions out of order, you've now robbed yourself of the opportunity for pattern recognition. Okay, and pattern recognition is what is going to lead you to make consistently strong account executive hires. So if you want your hiring process to predict sales success, it needs to be repetitious. Okay, it should feel like you're doing the same thing over and over, same stages, same steps. That's how you weed out signal rather than noise. Okay, number 3, overinvest in referrals from your existing team. Now, don't skip this part of the video. I know you're about to, because this is very common knowledge. Anybody's going to tell you to overinvest in referrals from your existing top producers. There are 2 caveats to this one, though, so stick with me. Number 1, you probably already understand the value is usually you can verify past performance. But the big thing about referrals is you can make it clear to your people that their brands are on the line. Okay, you can make it clear that you only want them to make a referral if they're willing to stake their reputation at their company for the person they're referring. And so the first caveat to the whole referral generation idea is press on your people. Okay, because a lot of sales reps are going to just want to bring their friends over to work with them, not necessarily because they think their friends are going to be top producers, but they just want to work with their friends. And hey, they also might think this person could be successful, but that's not always what they're leading with mentally. And so the talk track that we used at Gong consistently is when somebody offered a referral, we would say, knowing that that person's success or failure would get associated with you and your brand within this company, would you bet your career on them? Now, I realize that's an intense talk track, but that's what it takes to maintain a very high bar for talent in the face of rapid growth and scaling headcount. Now, the last thing I'll say about referrals before we move on is just make sure you're consistent with it. That's the second caveat. Everybody says to do referrals. Very few sales leaders do it with the vigor necessary. So keep the drumbeat going. Make sure your managers have a recurring 2 to 5 minute agenda item with all of their best people asking for referrals. Okay, this isn't a one-off event. This is programmatic. Okay, number 4, move the end of the hiring process to the beginning by doing a virtual back channel. Okay, a virtual back channel. Most of us do back channels at the end of the hiring process when we're ready to make a hiring decision. The problem with that is after you've already sunk a bunch of time, it's hard to reverse a decision. You're more likely to make hiring mistakes, but also you already spent all that time. And so the idea is to do, if you have an opportunity to do a very quick back channel toward the beginning of the hiring process, do it, because time isn't on your side when you're growing headcount fast, right? You can't afford to invest an entire hiring process on somebody who turns up, a flop when it comes to your back channel toward the end. And so what we did pretty consistently is after the initial screen, right, the hiring manager screen, once that hiring manager felt like they wanted to advance that candidate into a hiring process, they'd jump on LinkedIn, see if we had any mutual connections, both internally and the mutual connections on LinkedIn, and we'd shoot them a quick note. It wouldn't be over the phone. It would just be, noticed you're connected to Johnny. We're considering hiring him. I'm curious to get your opinion on him, and this is the key point, and whether he's in the top quartile of all reps you've ever worked with. Now, that last question is a far better question than would you hire him or her again, right? When you ask, is he or she in the top quartile of reps you've ever worked with, you'll get very rich, telling answers. And by the way, top quartile is what you should be shooting for if you're aiming to keep a very high bar for talent. So give that a try. Number 5, this one's really simple, and there's only so much to be said about it. Move the mock discovery toward the beginning of the hiring process rather than the end. Okay, so most companies who do mock sales meetings or mock discovery calls in their hiring process do it as the final step of the hiring process. Now, if you're growing slowly, that makes sense, and you should do it at the end. The problem is if you're growing fast, you can't afford to invest all of the time it took in a hiring process with somebody only for them to bomb it at the end in the mock. Okay, you want that information up front so that you don't have to overinvest all, the rest of the hiring process if somebody can't cut it from a selling skills perspective. Okay, so the goal is don't move it to the first step, but after the initial hiring manager screen, the next step should be the mock discovery call so that you're not spending a lot of time with people who can't cut it when it comes to a selling skills perspective. The last thing I'll say about that is it'll feel heavy to your frontline managers because they will spend more time in mocks. But when you take all of the hours they're spending on hiring combined, including mocks and full-blown hiring processes, they'll end up spending less total time on hiring, but a little bit more time on mocks. Okay, so net, you're freeing up some of their time. Okay, number 6, do a structured interview with a well-trained interviewer outside of the impacted team. Okay, so the reason for this is hiring managers, if they start to fall behind their hiring plans, they'll get desperate to fill headcount and they'll start to become subject to making really bad decisions. Okay, so you need somebody as part of the hiring process that doesn't have a dog in the fight or a stake in the game to interview them. Usually this says somewhere in the middle or even end of the hiring process, and there's a few good options. You can get a senior leader if you have time or if they have time. You can get a well-trained cross-functional partner who knows how to do very structured predictive interviews if you have that person. The third option is some people hire outside experts, like really seasoned sales leaders, to do interviews for candidates, but that's not always the case if you're hiring with a lot of volume. And then fourth, and this is why customers come to us a lot, is using a quota signal interviewer, a well-trained expert interviewer to do a deep dive 360-degree interview on your behalf with all of your account executive candidates to give you that second opinion before you move them through the rest of the hiring process. So we already talked about this. We can get to number 7, get scary good at reference calls. Okay, so reference calls in general are a waste of time if you do them like most people. Now, here's how to make them worth your time. The first step is tee up the reference call in a way that thaws out and loosens up your reference, right? References don't like to give bad references, so you need to put them at ease. And typically what that sounds like is, this is going to be a different reference call than you're used to. We already intend on working with Sally. Really, we just want to get your take on their strengths and weaker points so we can develop him or her accordingly when she comes into the business. Okay, so that lowers their guard because they know we intend on hiring that person, which we do, unless we find out something we don't like in the interviewer or in the reference call. And now they're far more likely to give you some truth. Okay, so this talk track is like a little bit of a truth serum. And now, once you've done that, there are 3 questions to ask in a predictive reference call. Number 1 is walk me through in detail their strengths and weaknesses as a SaaS seller or enterprise seller or SDR or whatever role you're hiring for. Don't just ask them about their strengths and weaknesses because they'll talk about general personality traits. Ask them about strengths and weaknesses in the context of the job that you're hiring them for. Okay, and push them for examples. If they say they're weak when it comes to making decisions, they get caught in analysis paralysis, follow up with what's an example of that. Okay, the examples that you get in reference calls are worth their weight in gold and will often change the hiring decision you plan on making based on what you learned. Okay, question number 2 is actually not a question, it's a statement. You say, I understand she is, and then fill in the blank with like a red flag or weakness and then just shut up and let the reference respond. Okay, so an example of this could be, I understand James has very high business acumen, but he can be a bit lazy when it comes to his prospecting habits. And now just be quiet and let the reference respond to that. Now, sometimes they might go, no, you're totally crazy. He's amazing, which is a great sign. But other times they're going to agree with you and go, yeah, I was on his case all the time about building pipeline. He never did it. He's great at selling, but I hope you have SDRs because he's not going to build his own pipeline. So try this, if you have red flags, yellow flags, weaknesses that you're kind of worried about, try this, make it a statement and don't follow it up with like, is that true? Because it's easy for them to refute. Just say, I understand James is on the weaker side when it comes to building pipeline. And pause really awkwardly for 4 or 5 seconds. So give that a try. And then the third and final question to ask during your reference call is trying to understand their stack rank. Remember when we said you should be aiming to hire top quartile reps? So you'll say something like this: I want to get a sense of where she'll land on the stack rank so I can develop her accordingly, right? I develop A players a little bit different than like middle of the pack. So of all of the reps you've ever worked with in your career, what percentile do you think she would wind up in? And you're looking for top 25%, right? If you're really trying to maintain a high talent bar while you're scaling, pass on people who are not at least in the top 33% consistently with their reference calls. Okay, number 8, create solid career pathing. Okay, so people join fast-growing scale-ups because they tend to offer accelerated career opportunities. They're a little bit higher risk, higher reward when it comes to career advancement. And when you aren't clear on what the advancement opportunities are and what's the promotion criteria to get there, your best people get frustrated. I made this mistake in spades my first year as a sales leader. My people would continually push me on visibility and transparency into career opportunities. And I didn't have that well defined. When I look back in hindsight, it was because of laziness, right? I just didn't do the work. But I also just assumed people could cope with ambiguity at the same rate that I could. My boss would tell me, career opportunities, they're going to be sprouting up left and right. This company's growing like crazy. I can't tell you exactly what they are right now, but they're going to be everywhere. Now, that resonated with me, but I also have an exceptionally high ability to deal with and cope with ambiguity. Most people don't. Okay, so that kind of ambiguity is not going to cut it when it comes to your best reps. Some of them will be able to handle it and they'll understand that. But you need to define, if you want to keep your high, bar for talent and the people that come with it, you need to define very clear, transparent career paths that have pass-fail promotion criteria attached to it. So I can't tell you exactly what that looks like. Maybe we'll have a follow-up video on like some examples that I've used from the past. But the point is, do the work. Don't be lazy about this thing. Give your people the opportunity to advance their careers with clear career paths and clear promotion criteria associated with those career paths. Number 9, and the final one, the least popular one, establish performance management standards and manage to them with a no excuses mentality. A lot of people aren't going to like this one, but you can choose to be well liked, or you can choose to scale and maintain a very high bar for talent. You cannot always do both of those things. Now, one of the reasons this is important is because what you demand from a performance standpoint will dictate the acceptable bar for talent. Great talent can descend into being mediocre talent if you don't hold them accountable, right? Accountability keeps your bar where it needs to be. Now, a rule of thumb for sales leaders, this is almost always true. By the time you acted on a performance issue with somebody, it's been too long. I've never seen a situation where somebody acted with the swiftness necessary. It's almost always been too long. So if you sense it, act on it. I'm not saying immediately go fire the person, but go have a conversation with them about their performance. Now, one of the principles you need to keep in mind is your weakest producer. Think about your weakest producer on your team. They define your current bar for talent. Are you okay with that? Now, if your weakest producer is actually pretty good, you might be in good shape. But if thinking about that question or your answer to that question sink your stomach a little bit, then that's probably a sign that you have some addressing to do when it comes to somebody's performance or lack thereof. So manage out mishires fast. And the corollary to this, the corollary to defining promotion criteria is define clear and transparent performance management criteria. It should feel very if then. And that actually has a counterintuitive effect of reducing fear in your sales organization. Even though when you introduce performance management criteria, it can kind of freak everybody out in that moment, the long-term effect will be a reduction in fear and an increase in psychological safety because people won't be guessing when they're safe and when they're not. If you're clear about when somebody goes on a PIP or a performance improvement plan, then reps don't have to sit here wondering and stewing and ruminating as to whether or not they're in trouble. They'll know whether or not they are, which frees them to either be fearless or to have justified fear. Okay, so examples of performance management criteria, probably for another video, but the point is define these things and hold to them with rigor, right? No excuses mentality. Now, here's exactly what to do next. Download this free cheat sheet, right? We talked about a lot of tips to maintain a high bar for account executive talent while you're scaling toward $100 million. You need great interview questions to be able to identify that question or identify great talent. So I have 91 interview questions for hiring SaaS reps that sell like crazy, and they're all sorted by attribute. So if you've defined your 6 to 8 attributes, you can simply click on those attributes in this cheat sheet, and it will tell you exactly what questions you should be asking your account executive talent or candidates. So I'm going to put a link to it in the description of this video. Go there right now and download it and make sure you start using this. Over 5,000 sales leaders are using it and using it very successfully. And I've got a bonus for you. When you do download this cheat sheet, I'm going to send you my top few tips on scaling SaaS sales organizations, some of them that we didn't discuss in this video, absolutely free. I'm going to send you maybe 3 to 5 of them, one every few days via email for the next several days. Or probably next couple weeks. So go download that cheat sheet. The link is in the description to this video. You'll get my bonus tips along with it. Go there now, and I'll see you in the next video.